my friend and brother, Abraham Awolich. The last time we spoke, Abraham, you were just back from Africa, from your home region, Sudan, South Sudan region, and things weren't very good. So I think between then and now, you've traveled back to that region. Would you just tell us what exactly you did, update us on your movements and what you've discovered?
Well, first of all, I went for a visit to see my family and also to do some work with my colleagues who are based in the region and also within South Sudan. They are able to come out and meet with us and go back in, partly because it is not safe for me and some of my colleagues to get back into the country. And what we are trying to do is to find ways to help South Sudan to exit the crisis that have been ongoing since 2013. And it is essentially a crisis of leadership in the country. We got our independence in 2011. Today is 2022. We have not had an election yet as a country. And people are fighting over leadership in ways that are not consistent with the Constitution. And so both the opposition groups that are looking to take power, they don't want election. They want to take it by force. And the president, who is incumbent, also doesn't want election. He wants to keep it by force. And as a result, the country is in multiple crises, crisis of displacement, crisis of killing and death and human rights violations, and also crisis of economic crisis. The economy has collapsed. So many young people are unemployed, and public servants are not getting paid. And so there are just so many crises at different levels. And the government has also been unable to contain insecurity and communal violence that are widespread across the country. And so the country is really in a crisis. And so we are looking for ways how best we can help the country to exit this crisis, this multiple crisis. And
Let me ask you a few questions.
That's right. Go ahead.
Let me ask you a few questions. During your recent trip, you sent me a quick note and you said that things were really, really bad. So we know from our previous conversation, you talked about people that actually had been hunted and arrested, and a number of people had been killed and people wounded and injured. What did you see this time that made you think things were really, really bad, I suppose, worse than what you'd seen before?
Well, as I speak to you now, there is a region, the northern region of South Sudan is called Upper Nile region. There is an ongoing conflict right now. And local people there reported that about 3,000 people were murdered there. And it is a conflict that is so difficult to understand because the government is part of it. Local armed militia groups are part of it, and the communities that live there are part of it. And it is a very messy conflict, especially in what we call the Sholo Kingdom, which is one of the ethnic groups in South Sudan. There is a fighting there that has been ongoing, and many people are displaced. And you could hardly find people living in their own communities. People have fled the country, and they have also fled to UN protection sites. These are places where the UN troops are deployed. People go there to seek shelter. And so that is what worries me, that that conflict has taken a different dimension, and the atrocities being committed there begin to worry me. They look like some sort of ethnic cleansing, and there are so many players involved in that. One of the local warlords being supported by the government against a former ally warlord also, who tend to, they live in the same space and they don't seem to want to tolerate each other. And so they form different alliances with ethnic communities and also with government and other opposition groups. And killing is just what is going on there. And the killing is against the local people, including fishermen, people who are just fishing in the Nile. They get caught there, get killed.
Yeah.
And so I'm very worried that if that conflict continues that way, the likelihood that South Sudan could return to large-scale ethnic based conflict is highly likely.
Abraham, what is it that you and your colleagues propose to do to stop this?
Well, we in 2021 we had proposed two things. One, between 2017 and 2020, the people of South Sudan had a national dialogue. The national dialogue was to figure out how best to coexist as a people in the country and how best to reconfigure the political space so that people can return to democracy. And they made a lot of meaningful resolutions, which, if implemented, could have united the country and put the country back on the path of stability. But the leadership in South Sudan rejected that because the resolutions included asking the two leaders who have been at the center of conflict to step aside and to allow for renewed elections. So those resolutions were entirely rejected by the government. And so we are advocating that those resolutions should be implemented because they hold the hopes and aspirations of the people of South Sudan. So that is one. Number two, we are saying that in the event that the peace agreement which they signed in 2018 and is not being implemented, is not working, we need to call a roundtable conference. And for a roundtable conference, we are simply saying, let the citizens of South Sudan and various political groups meet to reach a constitutional agreement, an agreement that outlines the rules that will govern the country and the political activities that are agreed to by all the people of South Sudan, and now use that constitutional agreement to hold new elections so that those who will govern South Sudan are governing South Sudan on the basis of people's consensus or people's consent. So that is what we have been calling for. And of course, the government doesn't like that. And that is partly why we got kicked out.
All right. So that is not the only thing they've done in terms of kicking you out. There have been attempts on your life, the attempts on the lives of your colleagues and friends and family. And I'm wondering if you will just update us on your situation. I think you told me there was a small piece of good news the other day.
That's right.
I just wonder how big a news was it that took place and exactly what happened?
Well, when we issued a statement in July 2021, the government immediately issued an arrest warrant for all of us, or issued a threat to our lives. And so we immediately went into hiding. But one of our colleagues was captured, was arrested by the government and detained for 17 months without trial. And based on our pressure, which we created with the international organizations, a lot of pressure was put on government to take him to court. Because we were confident that there was nothing wrong with it. What we did was consistent with what our constitution requires. And so he was taken to court in September, and that court proceeding has been ongoing. 7 of us were charged of treason by the government, including this man, that the fact that we spoke out, that we wanted to agitate people and And so we were charged with treason and other serious charges. Now the court process went on, and the government was not able to provide any evidence of what they allege. And so the case was thrown out entirely, and the court unconditionally released our colleagues. And so now he's a free man. So by extension, that means we have no case to answer. The government was essentially trying to intimidate us outside the law. And the court, in a surprising ruling, because normally the government sort of dictate what sort of ruling should come up.
Okay.
But the judges decided that this is an important case for even them. The freedom of speech and freedom of expression was on trial.
Okay.
And so they rule in favor of the freedom of speech.
So does that give you any hope that there is maybe even some small movement taking place inside the country in terms of pushing back against this regime and against the way in which the country has slid down this authoritarian slope?
Absolutely. There were 50 lawyers that volunteered to defend our case in the court. They did not ask for a dime. They did it pro bono. And the judges themselves say that the Constitution of South Sudan is important and must be protected. And those who use the constitutional rights that are given must be protected. And so that gives us a sense of hope, and the support, the outpour of support. When governor was released, the court was full. A lot of people came because they also believe that they were all being put on trial for their freedom. And so we think that there is a positive movement towards people pushing for their space to remain open.
You are here in the United States now, and you're obviously here for an obvious reason. I mean, yeah, we know the story, the wonderful story about you. Well, I won't say wonderful. Maybe it was wonderful for us because, you know, we saw the resilience and we saw the courage and the strength that you and your friends exhibited when, you know, you came here to the U.S. As a part of what we now look back on as, and you know, I've said this before and I'll say it again, you were part of this group called the Lost Boys, but I don't think were ever lost. You knew exactly where you wanted to go, what you wanted to do, and you plotted your course to get there. You're in the United States now, and I'm wondering what kind of support are you getting here for this, for the work that you're trying to do, for the change that you're trying to effect in South Sudan?
Well, I have friends like yourselves and others, some friends in Vermont that have been very supportive, including Senator Patrick Leahy and some of his staffers who have been very supportive, and some members of Congress who are sympathetic to the cause of the situation in South Sudan. But our objective, really, my objective being here had largely been to try to influence the United States to look at the situation in South Sudan as a crisis, and a crisis that requires support to the voices of ordinary citizens. And I have found that you know, the American government, because of so many years of interaction and lack of progress, there is generally people have lost interest. And so there is not much in the way of support at the highest level of the US government to the cause that we are advocating for. But we are not giving up. We are engaging people in the State Department who are sympathetic to what we are doing and who are directly interacting with people on the ground on daily basis and aware of what is going on. Where we have not made meaningful progress is in the White House, in the leadership, in the administration. There is no movement at all in that direction, and so we still we are advocating that the American people should not forget the people of South Sudan. They supported them to achieve the independence that we have now. And we still have formative challenges, trying to form our state and to create the nation. There are challenges there. And we have leaders who, by no fault of their own, had little exposure because they were denied education in the old Sudan. And that is the reason we had to fight for our freedom in the first place. But they found themselves in leadership position, and their vision for the country is limited, and their aspiration for the future of the people is one that has not been very helpful, and the exercise of political freedom has been constrained. And so we think that continuous U.S. involvement is important. There is an obligation on the side of the United States to support emerging nations, especially nations that they help bring to life. And therefore, that obligation is what we are advocating for, that you should not forget, and that mistakes are made, and the mistakes are not for the ordinary people. These are leaders who make those mistakes. And if the ordinary people are not able to hold those leaders accountable because of the power structure that has been created in the country, they should get support. So that is what we are advocating for, and we are asking ordinary American citizens to support our cause.
Yeah.
Whether by advocating on our behalf or giving us any financial support to strengthen our position on the ground, to expand the movement that we are building for freedom. I think those small things go a long way in making a difference.
So I'm disappointed to hear that you're not getting any real traction with the White House, especially with this particular administration. One would think that they would be willing and engaged in every effort to reach out to individuals like yourself. And it's really interesting that we're having this conversation today on the third day of the Africa Leadership Summit. And I'm wondering, were you involved or invited at all by this administration to participate in anything?
Well, no, I was not invited, although I had asked to be involved. But there was a side event that happened yesterday at the United States Institute of Peace, where a group of people working on South Sudan issues called South Sudan Working Group had a meeting. And of course, I was invited to participate in that meeting. So that is very much that is how I got involved in that. But otherwise, I would have loved to be involved in a more robust way, so that I can explain to people who have come to listen to the issues affecting South Sudan, to see my perspective that is different from others. But there were challenges with that, and which I understand. And but I got involved yesterday with this event, which I'm very thankful for.
All right, Abraham, what have I not asked you about in this conversation that you think is important enough for us to talk about?
Well, maybe it's specifically the role that American people could play. That I know South Sudan has been on the news for a very long time for all the bad reasons, including the fact that we came to this country as young people who did not have parents or people, guardians. That was enough to tell the story of a country that we left behind. But every human tragic story has a happy side of it. We got South Sudan independence, and we have done our best here to take advantage of the generosity of the American people and also their support. And we want to extend its support to change situation in our country so that no generation like us would leave their own country to seek safety across the oceans. And we are afraid with the current trend of events, we may see a new generation of people leaving South Sudan to seek safety outside. And that would sadden us, that would make us very sad. And so we really think that we need to regenerate the support of the American people and their concern so that they can inform the government and those in Congress that South Sudan remains an important place and the people continue to suffer and we need change to take place. I think that would be awesome.
Abraham Awolich, thank you so much for everything that you are doing for South Sudan. Thank you for everything you're doing for Africa and for the rest of the world. Now tell everyone what your organization is and your title with that organization and how they can contact you.
Well, first of all, I have a nonprofit organization based in Vermont. It's called SUDEF, SUDEF.org. And it is, I have been using that organization to provide humanitarian support back home and support schools and hospitals. But the organization that I'm using for advocacy now is the People's Coalition for Civil Action, a South Sudan-based human rights pro-democracy movement. It's called the PCCA in short. We have not registered that organization yet as to receive support, but we can get support through the Sudan Development Foundation. So thank you very much.
All right, and
of course I am the co-founder of the PCCA.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, we will pass that information on this program, and we thank you for again to joining us to talk with us about these important matters. And we will continue this conversation. We will continue this dialogue, and I would dare say we'll continue this until the change in South Sudan that needs to happen. So thank you again, Abraham.
Thank you so much, my brother. Appreciate it, and my appreciation to all the listeners.
We're joined today by Greta Uehling. She is a professor, PhD. She's a writer, a very interesting person, and she's written a book called Everyday War. I'll let her get into the subtitle and all of that. But as you know, from watching what we do here on Global with JJ Green, we've talked a lot about the Ukraine war. And she has written an interesting novel that I think might be beneficial as we take a look further at what's taking place there, what has happened, and what likely will happen. So, Greta, thank you for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you give us a sense of what the Everyday War is about?
Yeah, so Everyday War, the book explores the experience of civilians that have been affected by the war in Ukraine. Based on my research in Ukraine that included over 150 interviews. And I think one of the core insights of the book is that maintaining a binary distinction between combatants and civilians in this particular type of war is really only a comforting illusion. So I try to show how, why, and with what consequences civilians became deeply involved in the military conflict.
Why did you decide to write this?
You know, I was very much motivated to write this book when I realized, as a result of my time in Ukraine, that many of my ideas about war were not accurate. I came to the conclusion that, conventional ideas about war are incomplete. I think when it comes to Everyday War, Alexandra is sort of a perfect example. She and her family were forcibly displaced. Her father went back to fight against the Russian-backed separatists. as part of a volunteer battalion in 2015. He had to come up with his equipment on his own, however. So Alexandra collected donations to purchase his equipment, from the bulletproof vest to the tactical gloves and special night vision goggles. Her everyday life was organized not around university studies or friends, even though she was only 22. Her life was organized around enabling her father to basically kill people who had previously been their neighbors. And so I use this term, everyday war, to talk about how civilians engaged both directly through only seemingly mundane activities and indirectly. And I think that, since the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainians' robust response to Russian aggression is really consistent with, and in many ways amplifies, the findings of my book.
That's one of the really, that's
Pardon?
one of the really interesting things about this war, is that a lot of people don't know that this war didn't start in February of this year. It started 2008, 2009, a long time ago. But we saw this big explosion of animosity in 2014, realistically, in Ukraine, when Russia amassed on its borders troops and weapons and essentially took over parts of that country. But it started a long time before that, with some of the activity in Georgia and some of the stuff in Estonia back in 2007. But what you're doing is giving people, from my perspective, a window into how to process how people must go on with their lives despite this whole thing happening underneath them, and essentially the world moving underneath them. I'm assuming that this is based on true events, factual events, but it's written in this format to obviously express what it is that you want to say. Am I correct about that? And tell me about the characters here in the book too.
Yeah, so I did research in Ukraine over like a 3-year period as a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine, and that involved going to the country, talking to people who had been internally displaced, as well as talking to social workers, government officials, the people who had decided to make it their mission to help people that were struggling with the war. So as a result, I took those interviews, analyzed them, and then wrote this book. I think that a lot of people think, when they think of war, they think of something that's like an action film, right? When in reality, it moves so much more slowly, with so much more precision and predictability. So in the eastern provinces, people knew the exact amount of time that it would take the Russian forces to reload. And they would use that time, 15 minutes, to run an errand, right? Go out and get bread. So you're very correct in saying that, yes, daily life goes on. In addition to those times and those places where really all you can do is shelter where you are.
That's really remarkable that you mentioned that, because there is a massive strike today in a number of cities around the country. And I communicate with several, a number of people there, and one of them is a member of parliament who sent me a WhatsApp message earlier today saying, okay, this is what I'm doing in the house. She had these buckets that she had collected water in because she knew that the water was going to go out in an hour. You know what I'm saying? So what you were saying before about people knowing the exact amount of time that they have to do things, these are things we don't think about, and we don't recognize the importance of those things when it comes to survival in these war zones and for these people. And I also think it's pretty remarkable too, when we see these images of people down in the metro in Kyiv. And one of these sources sent me a video the other day they were dancing down in the metro while the strike was going on. People are trying everything they can to continue living their life the best they can, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the ways I think is useful to think about that is, that in addition to this horrific destruction, so in addition to this horrific destruction, all of the humanitarian problems that have resulted in this war, I found that the destruction of war is accompanied by a corresponding evolution in the capacity to care, right? So we've heard about how the conflict has unified Ukraine, how it's contributed to integrating Ukraine in Europe. And I think what I add to that picture is that the military conflict led people to express levels of responsibility and care for each other that they themselves characterized as unprecedented. So in the book, I talk about the volunteer body collectors. I know one who came out of retirement to lead teams into non-government controlled areas, driving on mined roads, negotiating face to face with people who are armed. And, why? Why? That was the question I kept asking over and over again. And, they said they wanted to bring the families of the deceased peace of mind, even if they couldn't bring peace itself. So there was just, just all kinds of efforts going on.
Yeah. So when you talk to these people, did they talk to you at all about their hopes and dreams for ending this kind of aggression, this kind of this tension that they've had with Russia for a lot longer than since 2014, or even this century? This is stuff that goes back a long time. Did they talk to you about their hopes and dreams for their children, their families, moving beyond this situation?
They do. I think that, Ukrainians have a great deal of resolve, that they want to have their territorial integrity respected and honored, and that the loss, the four territories that Vladimir Putin has claimed to have, annexed or claims to control, that's non-negotiable, right? They want those territories returned. So I think that is a really big part of what peace means for Ukrainians. That said, I think it's also important to be aware of the extent to which, when you are in a zone with active fighting, sometimes it becomes very, very difficult to hope, right? I had one man say that his highest hope was to die quickly without suffering.
Wow. Wow. So I was going to ask you if you could share a story or two with me about, the people you spoke to, in order to write your book, some of the things that you were most, that created the most, I guess, the biggest impression on you. That seems like it would be one of those stories. Are there others?
That is one of those stories. And oh gosh, it's hard to know where to begin. There's so many. I mean, there's Alexandra, right? This 22-year-old woman who went around buying night vision goggles for her father and then driving them to the front. Let's see, who else? Well, there's Dmitry, and he lived in a small apartment in Donetsk, and he slept in his bathtub. That was the safest place. That was the only place he could feel reasonably assured that, if a bomb fell in the middle of the night, it wouldn't kill him. And then every morning he got up and went out the front door to, repair the infrastructure that had been destroyed during the night. So, another person didn't have a daughter that would go around and get donations and buy all this equipment for him. So he constructed a flak jacket for himself out of used newspapers.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this book seems like it could very well become a reference book or a tool to help out everyday people who are not in war zones understand how people, non-combatants, get on in war zones. And it may be, I know you teach at the University of Michigan, I think. And so I know this may become a very helpful tool for people as we move on in this war and others as well. What is it that you want people to get from this book when they read it?
You know, I think that I want people to rethink how it is that they, let's see, let me start over with that. I guess war has changed, right? There is no longer a comfortable distinction between residential areas and the front, or the personal and the political. And so I think it's important to think about the wars that are going on around the world today in terms that the civilian and the combatant are not necessarily as different as we might like to think. Civilians are drawn into wars in ways that are of consequence. So I gave you the example of a body collector, right? Civilian involvement matters for whether or not human remains are returned. It matters for where the front is. You know, the volunteer battalions were crucial in preventing the Russian-backed forces from advancing further into Ukraine, especially in the early stages. And it matters for whether a sniper has gloves or whether he ends up, you know, shooting himself or a comrade instead. And so civilians are important to the ways that wars are waged today.
You know what? You just made me think of something else that I want to ask before we go, and I'll make this my last question. You know, a lot of people have gone through some horrific things in Ukraine, and they're not unique to other people in other war-torn countries around the world. But how is it that people collect and gather themselves after going through these things to move forward? Were you able to gather any information or any insight into how Ukrainians are handling this process?
You know, I think that the shortest answer is that it takes a great deal of time. And we're going to be seeing the consequences of this war for the foreseeable future. Children in Ukraine learn the calibers of weapons and armaments before they learn to read, right? They learn when to go to a shelter before they even get to go to school. And so those traumas are complex, they're layered, and Ukrainians are developing ways to work with one another on this. Some of the methods are very innovative and have to do with, you know, just returning sensation. Some of them have to do with art. Some of them have to do with reducing the shame and encouraging people to talk about their experiences. But often that's the last thing, right, is talking about it. A lot of times the first step is just coming back into the present moment.
Well, Dr. Uehling, thank you. I appreciate the time, the opportunity to chat with you. You have some remarkable work here, and I would encourage everybody to pick it up, take a read, and you know, think about what's written here, because you're absolutely right. Especially in the time that we live in, we need to rethink how we look at war and how war impacts people, and heaven forbid, us or anybody who's not in a war zone now. Because truthfully speaking about this, you know, even though we were warned about this, up until the 24th of February, around 3 o'clock in the morning, nobody thought that a European city would be invaded again like it was during World War II. But here we are. So thank you again, Dr. Uehling.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.